we get started. So I'm Laura Casaragola. I'm a GrowNYC School Gardens Coordinator. And today, the facilitator of our workshop is Sarah Ward from National Wildlife Federation, and she'll tell us all about how to grow a wild NYC.
Thank you, Laura.
Take it away.
Hi, everyone. Okay, my name's Sarah Ward, and I'm the Schoolyard and Community Habitats Program Manager at National Wildlife Federation in New York City. I'm excited to be here today to share a new urban pollinator curriculum. And I'm excited there seem to be a lot of educators in the audience. So this is great. So I hope you find this to be a useful resource. Today we'll talk about the new curriculum, and then we'll also talk about some bees, butterflies, and insects, and how we can create habitat for them at our homes, at our schools, or in our communities. At National Wildlife Federation, our mission is to unite all Americans to ensure that wildlife thrive in a rapidly changing world. Our work supports policies and programs that connect people to nature and work to reverse the decline of wildlife species. In New York City, we lead educational programs that help educators and school communities increase students' environmental literacy and inspire them to take action for the environment. So our programs include schoolyard habitats, which guide schools in designing and creating school gardens that can support wildlife and can also function as outdoor classrooms. We also lead the Eco Schools program, as well as some climate education programs, including the Climate Education Task Force and the Resilient Schools Consortium. So here's a brief overview of what we'll cover today. And as Laura mentioned, we will leave plenty of time for questions at the end, but feel free to drop them in the chat before them, and hopefully we'll get to all of them. So the first thing we'll do is I'll give you an overview of the new curriculum, and then we'll spend some time just really like honing in on pollinators and on pollinator observations. I'll show you some sample activities from the curriculum that we can, I'll quiz you on a little bit here, just a really brief sample activities. And then we'll look at ways at how you can create a pollinator garden, and then other ways to connect to pollinators and the community of pollinator enthusiasts that are in New York City and all over the world. So the Growing the Wild New York City Urban Pollinator Curriculum, we just released it this year, and among many goals, what we wanted from this curriculum was to introduce students to the wild bees, butterflies, flies, insects, and other pollinators, and help them understand their critical ecological role. We want to engage students through direct experiences, scientific inquiry, and observations of pollinators and habitats. And we also want to inspire classes to create pollinator habitat that increases the biodiversity of our communities, and that can also be used as an outdoor classroom at schools. So what's in the curriculum? There's a lot in the curriculum. So you'll definitely get a link to it during this workshop, and it is free and available to download now. But the curriculum consists of 20 lessons, and each of these 20 lessons is typically made up of an indoor component as well as an outdoor activity. So the outdoor activities can take place in the school garden, if you have one, in local parks or community gardens, or on field trips to pollinator habitats within New York City. The activities are organized by seasons to ensure that there will be opportunities to observe pollinators during these times, and then also that any planting or gardening activities that coincide with the curriculum can also correspond to the season as well. I don't expect you to be able to read all of this. I just wanted to give you a sense of how it's organized with these next two slides. So if you're a teacher, what's in the curriculum for you is that you'll find background information for every lesson. You'll find the objectives of the lessons, a list of materials, how long the activities will take, as well as resources for each lesson, including books that you can read along with the lessons, or videos, or other types of websites or community science resources that could be used. Each lesson is also aligned to the next generation science standards, so that's embedded into each lesson while you're going through the curriculum. And for students, what's in the curriculum, it also includes worksheets that can be used to collect data outdoors, or worksheets that students can use to make sketches of their observations or to answer questions. There's also a ton of photos, as well as diagrams and field guides with descriptions of insects and pollinators. Here on the left, you'll see an example of one type of like a field guide is what sometimes I call them, but photos of insects with a description of them as well. So there's a number of these throughout the curriculum. And each student worksheet can be copied directly on a copy machine, and it includes a space for their name, the date, or to make observations about the weather or temperature if they're outdoors. With 20 lessons, we won't be able to get through all of the curriculum today, but I just want to leave you with some questions that you can explore, or that you can learn from yourself as you engage with this curriculum. So among many other topics and questions, you can explore the types of flowers that specific pollinators prefer. You can really get to know the food that we eat that is pollinated by animals and insects. What happens to butterflies and moths in winter. If you've never thought about that, this curriculum will really help you understand what these species do during winter. Where do wild bees make nests or raise their young? And then how can we provide habitat to pollinators in our schoolyard? So these are all the questions and more that you can explore with the curriculum. So here I want to just switch gears a little bit and share some tips for making pollinator observations with children or by yourself, right? And we'll also practice using some of the resources and activities from the curriculum. So we'll see how we'll start to sharpen our own observations of pollinators using photos. So before we do that, just a little bit of a review for anybody that may need it. And so what is a pollinator? What are pollinators? So what do I mean when I say that over and over during this? And this is, of course, the main substance of the Growing a Wild NYC curriculum. Pollinators are animals that move from plant to plant while searching for food. They're looking for protein-rich pollen or high-energy nectar. And as they travel from flower to flower, they're dusted by pollen and they move it from flower to flower. And this leads to fertilization, which also will begin the process so the plant is able to reproduce. Plants and pollinators have co-evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, and they form this mutually beneficial relationship. Flowers have adapted to lure pollinators to them to assist them with plant reproduction. So the shape, the color, and the fragrance of a flower attracts pollinators. Pollinators are rewarded for assisting this reproduction with the nectar or the pollen for themselves, as well as their young. Bees and butterflies are well-known pollinators, but in addition to them as pollinators, there are over 100,000 invertebrates, which act as pollinators, and over 1,000 mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians that also pollinate flowers all over the world. Here in New York City, you'll find bees, butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, the ruby-throated hummingbird occasionally, as well as some other insect pollinators. Here's just a little more information or to help you understand why pollinators are so important. They're vital to life on Earth. They support the health of the planet and ecosystems directly and indirectly. The pollinators are vital to people. They are responsible for 1 in 3 bites of food that we eat. So our apples, our blueberries, our tomatoes, almonds, and squash are dependent on pollinators. Even if you eat meat, cattle depend on clover and alfalfa, which are insect pollinated. So if pollinators disappear, so would 1/3 of our food supply. And we hear this often when we talk about the threats to pollinators and why they are so important to our food supply. Pollinators are also vital to wildlife. They help plants produce the seeds, fruits, and nuts which wildlife depend on. And pollinators themselves also become food for animals. So birds may eat pollinating insects. Birds certainly eat caterpillars. They're really important for a bird when it's feeding its young. And then pollinators, of course, are essential to plants. They aid plants in their reproduction, and over 85% of flowering plants on Earth depend upon an animal for pollination. Okay, so here's some cute pollinators. I am going to linger here for a moment, and I'm going to make a few points while we're on these slides. So one is that looking for pollinators and closely observing them is very rewarding. They have fascinating behaviors and adaptations, and it can be really fun to simply watch them. It can be really fun to start searching for them as well. New York City is home to 230 species of bees alone. And once you start looking for them, as well as the butterflies, the flower flies, the beetles, and all the other insects, it can open up a whole new world for you or your students. And you're really able to see pollination in action. In these photos, you can see how the pollen sticks to the bees' bodies and how they're able to transfer it from flower to flower. The second point I want to make when looking at these close-up photos of bees is that, unfortunately, bees can cause fear in many children and even in some adults. One reason is that they're often mistaken for wasps, and wasps do have the tendency to be slightly more aggressive if they feel threatened or they're sometimes territorial. So that's one reason, but bees are not aggressive at all. They really are interested in finding nectar and pollen. And if you let them go about their business, they should steer clear of people. If there are children in your group that are scared of bees, just encourage them to remain calm when they're near the bees, or model how you can observe them so that they can see that the bees are not coming after them and that they're not really interested in people. Just take incremental steps to help them get to that point. And then the final point I want to make here is that the Growing the Wild NYC urban pollinator curriculum, it really focuses on wild pollinators. And so I want to make that distinction between wild pollinators and honeybees. If you don't know this, honeybees are not considered wild because they are managed by people. So people bring a swarm in and they collect honey and they use them for a lot of agricultural services, for pollination services in agriculture. They're not native to North America. And unfortunately, there's a growing body of research that suggests that honeybees may be harmful to some of our native bee populations because they outcompete with them for flowers, for these floral resources, and they may also spread diseases too. So honeybees are pollinators, and they are they're fairly common in New York City. But for our purposes, we really want to focus on the wild species that live here. And just to show you how close you can get to bees, I have a brief video here. It's less than a minute, and I took this almost a year ago at a neighborhood park, Parks Department park, city block, you know, and has traditional Parks Department plantings. And I wanted to show you how uninterested they are in you and how close you can get to them as well. So, and then also just highlight that, that there are pollinators and bees in our neighborhoods. We just have to start looking for them. Yeah, so yeah, just with my iPhone really close to them, and they do not mind you at all. Yeah, you could almost pet them sometimes, I think, because they just have other things on their mind. They have flowers on their mind. And another reason I want to share that too is just because you may not have a school garden, or you may not have your own garden at home, but there are a lot of places in the city where you can observe pollinators, and we'll talk a little bit about that more later. So next I want to just show you a few sample activities that you translated to this virtual setting, and I hope they help you sharpen your own observations and yeah, help you maybe learn something about bees or pollinators today. I'm not expecting you to read this, but this is an example of a bee guide that's in the curriculum. You can see that these are all New York City, these are all bees that you find in New York City, and they're organized by their size, with large bees, medium bees, and small bees, and a couple bee lookalikes. And you have this photo of them on a white background, and then some other descriptive information for them. So students can get a copy of this, and they can start to study and learn the names of some of the bees in New York City, and they can start to look at some of their features or distinguish between some of the features of the different bees. The next part of the activity is that they would try to identify what the bees are in a different setting. So this would be more of how you would observe bees outside, right? They're not sitting on a white background. They may be near plants, they may be flying. So you can just start to hone in on some of these features of the bees to see if you can begin to identify them. And I'll also just say that identifying bees down to their species can be really difficult, even for for trained scientists. Like sometimes you have to collect the bees and actually take measurements to really determine the species. But some of the bees in New York City you can identify with your by sight. So it's just starting to really sharpen your observations. So on the top row, you have the answer bank. So you have two photos here, the one on the left and the one on the right. And if you think you know which species of bees they are based on the 4 that are in the top row, you can write your answers in the chat. You can just list it left, right, so the letters. I'll see if anybody wants to play. Does anybody think they know what this one is on the left?
There are some guesses coming in on the chat.
Yeah, I see some. Thank you all for indulging me with this.
This one's tricky. I feel like the one on the left is harder.
Yeah, it's tricky. There is a clue in there, but so yeah, this is really difficult. And I probably, if so the one on the left is D. This is a leaf cutter bee. And so one clue is that it's carrying this leaf right here, you may notice, and they use leaves to line their nest. So that's one clue, but otherwise there's not a lot of distinguishing features that you can see, and it's hard to really tell the size of the bee from this photo, but that's one clue. And then for those of you that guessed A, the striped sweat bee for the photo on the right, you are correct. So yeah, this is a smaller bee, and you can really see the stripes on its abdomen. And sometimes it really has this like green shine to it, a green or a gold shine to it. So great work, everybody. This one's going to be a lot easier because you still have the next one, the same answer bank, and you know which two have already been used. So if you think you know the answers, which bee species these are, you can write them in the chat. Excellent. Thank you all so much for adding your answers here. And for all of you that said B and C respectively to the left and the right, you are correct. So the photo on the left is a picture of a longhorned bee, and the photo on the right side is a picture of an eastern carpenter bee. Yeah, and this one, the longhorn bee, you can really, it has that name because of the long antenna. So that is one way to distinguish it, but otherwise it may be really difficult because it does look like a lot of other bumblebee species. The eastern carpenter bee is, once you start seeing it, once you recognize it, you'll probably start seeing it more frequently, especially in spring. And it's the largest native bee species in North America. And it has a shiny abdomen that you can kind of see here. There were some carpenter bees in that video I just played too. And it also has this, this spot on its thorax as well that are help you identify it. But the size of it is really one factor that can help you there. So thank you again. So this would be an activity that students could do indoors, right? If you don't have an opportunity to go out, they can start to look at bee species and try to begin to identify them. And the next example are these Monarch life cycle cards. So this would be an activity, again, that you can do in the classroom. And these are cards that depict the Monarch life cycle from egg to adults. And you can cut them out for students and kind of mix them up. And then you can ask students to rearrange them in sequential order, beginning with the egg phase of the life cycle. So, and I'm going to ask you all to do this, and this will be a little bit more confusing because it might be eight items that you have to put in order. So if you feel like arranging these photos in order, you can just list the letters as they would appear. So if F is the first one, it could go F, A, E, whatever the order is. If anyone thinks they're up for it, I encourage you to just write those answers in the chat. if no one wants to do it, I can also just, I'm gonna just.
I think this one, I'm trying to do it myself too, and it takes
okay,
a little thinking time.
I won't rush you. Sorry.
I'm like halfway through.
And I actually didn't write this down, so I might just have to, I'm just gonna do it live. But thank you, Sandy and Cynthia, for putting in Margaret. It looks like, yeah, it looks like all of you have gotten it. Excellent. Yeah, so yay, thank you all for doing this. Yeah, so G would be the first one because that's an egg that you can barely see on the underside of that leaf. And then it goes to C, the caterpillar stage, the larva stage, and then it would go to F. No, sorry. And then it would go to H, and when it makes the chrysalis, and then it would go to F because it's starting to, it's just beginning to get closer to its emergence. And then it would go to A, and then D, and then E, and then B. It's adult stage where it's feeding on some milkweed. Yeah, so thank you all for doing that. I really appreciate it. Again, this is just another activity that you can do with students indoors, and it reinforces the life cycle of the butterfly, and then it also helps them begin to sharpen their observation skills so they can start to look for these insects, these butterflies, the caterpillars, while they're out in the field. One thing I haven't really mentioned today is that there are threats to pollinators, unfortunately. And so maybe you've heard about the decline in bee species or other pollinator species, but a lot of insect species, including pollinators, are declining at alarming rates. And there's many reasons for this. One is destruction of their habitat. So if all wildlife, including insects, they need places to feed, to nest, and to rest. And we've eliminated a lot of these habitats due to agriculture or human activities. Even our lawns are very destructive to pollinator habitats. And then another threat to pollinators, or another reason for their declines, is pesticide use, because it can have devastating effects on insects. So just keeping in mind that chemicals that are designed to kill plant pests will likely have negative effects on other species. So neonics are a group of systemic insecticide used widely in agriculture, and they're absorbed by plants and can be present in pollen and nectar, making them toxic to bees. But there is hope, and that's part of the reason why we wanted to create this urban pollinator curriculum, is that cities can play a really important role in reversing this decline in pollinator species. We can create pollinator patches at schools and parks. We can replace parts of our lawns with flowering plants. And when we're creating habitat for pollinators, we're increasing the overall biodiversity of the urban ecosystem, which benefits people as well as other species of wildlife. Yeah, and next we'll focus on how you can create this pollinator habitat, whether it's at the school, in your community, or at home. Okay, so all wildlife, all people, they need certain things to survive. They need food, water, cover, and places to raise their young. And so pollinators also need these things for their survival. And so when you're creating a pollinator garden, you should be sure to include all of these components so that pollinators can thrive. So for pollinators, plants are food. They need nectar from flowers for nutrients and energy, and they need pollen for protein and to feed their young. Also of note is that caterpillar, the larvae of butterflies and moths, they need leaves from their host plants for growth as they develop. So make sure you're including a food source during every season in your garden. That means plants that flower in spring, summer, and fall. And it also means host plants for the butterfly species. So butterflies will need nectar from flowers when they're adults, but they'll need the leaves of the host plant, of their host plants, when they're in the larval stage. This is a hummingbird moth on the right top corner, just and one of our pollinating moth species. And again, just like us, just like all living things, we need water to survive. Pollinators also need water to survive. We may not think about it when we're planting a garden or because they're so little, but they do need water. Butterflies get minerals from water, so shallow puddles or water sources can serve them because the water, as the water dissolves, it concentrates the minerals. A really great thing you can do, like this photo here on the bottom right, is that you can put out a shallow dish outdoors, and you can fill it with rocks or marbles here, and then fill it partially with water. And so the marbles or the rocks can serve as landing pads so that bees don't drown when they go and get a sip of water. And the same thing for butterflies. I've been seeing more and more puddling dishes. You can create a puddle, like I said before, or you can create a puddling dish so that they're able to get water when they need it. And pollinators need places to find shelter from the weather, from wind, and even extreme heat. They also need to be able to hide from predators. So plants, again, provide great hiding and sheltering places with their leaves, with like dense leaves or thorns. These are great places for pollinators to find cover. We'll talk a little bit more about the leaves that you see in the top right corner here on this slide. In a couple of slides, we'll talk more about that. But yeah, those can also be a source of cover and shelter for pollinators. And even just the underside of a leaf, like this caterpillar here, is also a source of cover so that it can make its chrysalis. So pollinators, they also need places to raise their young. Many native bees are solitary species, which means that they don't live together in a hive or nest. Instead, they build nests in soil, in the hollow stems of plants, or in wood. Therefore, it's important to leave some bare patches of soil in your garden if you can, and to also limit your use of mulch so that it's not too thick on top of the soil, so that bees have a place to burrow into the soil and make their nests. Another gardening task that you can do or not do is wait to cut your plants back in the spring. So leave them up through the fall and the winter. And once you cut them back in the spring, you can leave them like 6 to 12 inches. And then those hollow stems of those old plants can also become nest sites for some of our solitary bee species. And pollinators like the ruby-throated hummingbird also needs a place to raise their young, usually in dense trees or shrubs where they can find a place to build a nest. And I'll also add here, so places to raise their young for butterflies also means those host plants again, and that's why they're so important. So the adult butterfly will lay eggs on the host plant so that egg can like immediately begin, so the caterpillar can immediately begin eating. And here's some great photos of just some bee nests in sandy soil as well as loose soil. So the other thing that you can do in your garden is to use sustainable gardening practices. So one of those practices is to leave the leaves for wildlife. So as I mentioned before during the cover slide, many butterfly and moth species, they overwinter in leaf litter. So if you rake up and throw away all your leaves each fall, you'll be getting rid of those beneficial insects too. And so remember that butterfly and moth caterpillars, they're critically important food source for birds in the spring when they're feeding their babies. So we don't want to just like inadvertently remove all of them for the sake of a tidy garden. So if you remove all of them, there'll be fewer of these insects in the garden around spring. So it doesn't mean you have to leave the leaves like all over the garden. You can kind of break them up or use them like a mulch in some of the planting beds, just to kind of make sure it feels managed enough for you, for your comfort. And another really important things when we think about the threats to pollinators is to use organic practices when you garden. So don't use pesticides, practice organic gardening, making sure that you go chemical free, because it will ensure that your garden is a healthy, safe place for wildlife, as well as for you and your family. And then I'll just make a quick point here about why you should why choosing native plants in a pollinator garden or a wildlife garden is important. And it's going back to just the relationships between plants and pollinators, is that plants and wildlife, they've co-evolved over thousands of years. The plants are adapted to the local climate. They're usually more drought tolerant. And so non-native plants have not formed these beneficial relationships with pollinators. So the pollinators may not find nectar or pollen from exotic species, or they certainly wouldn't be a host plant for some of our butterfly species as well. And just to give one data point is that, especially when we're thinking about the importance of our host plants for butterflies, a white oak can support over 530 species of Lepidoptera, which is the insect order that includes butterflies and moths. And a ginkgo, which is a non-native species that's planted in a lot of urban environments, it supports one species of caterpillars. And so those caterpillars are critically important for birds when they're raising their young. If you want to, if you need help selecting plants for your pollinator garden, there's a couple of resources that we'll share with you at the end of this. One is this plant guide that's native wildflowers for pollinators, and the other is the National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finder, which you can just plug in your zip code to this, and it will bring back all of the plants with high ecological value that you can include in your garden. Oh, I have the time. How are we in time? I have another really brief video just because I like taking videos of pollinators, and this will show you pollinators just with some of these plants, some of these important plants for. So it really is simple as putting some of these plants in a garden and pollinators will find them. So, and after you've created your pollinator patch, I encourage you to certify it as a National Wildlife Federation wildlife habitat. So this just means that your garden provides food, water, cover for pollinators to raise their young. It helps, and it's a nice thing. You should be proud to display it, and it helps other people understand the type of planting with the purpose that you're doing. And then finally, I'll spend I know we're kind of close on time and I want to leave enough time for questions. I want to just encourage you to connect with pollinators and other. One way that's really great to do in New York City is to visit the parks, the community gardens, natural areas, greenways, and botanical gardens. There's a lot of beautiful plant species in these places that, and many of them are designed for wildlife and for pollinators in particular. So on this slide, you'll see a photo of the New York Botanical Garden, its native plant garden, which has a lot of, which features tons of native plants for wildlife and pollinators. If you're in Brooklyn, this the photo on the top right is a photo of the I'm freezing a little bit, aren't I? Okay. It's the Naval Cemetery, which is connected to the Brooklyn Greenway. On the bottom right is the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge. And I'm sorry, the bottom left. And on the bottom right, it's Central Park. So, and even like I showed you before in the first video, just your New York City Parks Department small park really has a lot of plantings that will also be beneficial for pollinators. So I encourage you to just look really closely if you're there in your own neighborhood, whether it's street tree beds or the local parks and community gardens. Uh-oh.
Sarah, I think your video is frozen a little bit, but I can still see your screen and hear you all right.
Oh, okay, thank you. So let me, I just lost all of your faces. So let me see if I can.
We can still see your PowerPoint though.
Oh, okay, good. So then I'll just keep talking.
Okay.
Another way to connect to pollinators and a community of pollinator enthusiasts is to use community science projects. And I'm just going to plug one, iNaturalist here. If you've never used this, it's a really wonderful way to get to know plants, insects, and animals wherever you are. You can download it on your phone. You can take a photo of a bee or what plant, whatever you see, and you can upload it. And if you don't know what the species is, scientists and other users will come in and help you identify it. So it provides a lot of really important data as we're tracking like which pollinator species are doing well in New York City, where are they? So you're contributing to a community science project, and it's a really great way to learn more about the pollinators that you're observing. And then finally, I want to encourage you to visit or even join the New York City Pollinator Working Group. This is a community of professionals, of teachers, of plant and
All right, I think something happened with Sarah's video, but she'll probably join us back in a minute. She was just talking about the New York City Pollinators Working Group, which I've been a part of for like a year or so since they've been around. And it's kind of like, I think it's a Google group that you can join in, and it's really good for some back and forth. If you have questions about pollinators or you heard of a really cool study being done in New York City about them, it's a really good place to share information and find other people who are super enthusiastic about pollinators. And I have a feeling a lot of people on this call fit that description. And so Emily Fano, who's from National Wildlife Federation here on the call today, is saying to go to their website. You can see what they're all about. So I'm not sure if, I know we have some questions for the Q&A. I'm not sure how long it's going to take Sarah to jump back in here. So let me, here she is. Okay. Luckily, we were at the end of the presentation, but we will leave some time for a Q&A. So we do have a few more minutes.
Yeah, sorry about that. Zoom just crashed.
Sometimes it takes, a lot of bandwidth and then it just crashes. But
yeah.
did you want to do anything else from the PowerPoint or go to the Q&A?
We can go to the Q&A. I'll share these resources with you, as including the Schoolyard Habitat Planning Guide, which is a wonderful resource that you can use at your school that really helps a habitat team and especially students design and plan a school garden that can also function as an outdoor classroom. There's a lot of green STEAM activities, mapping activities, and so it's another great resource that that complements the Growing a Wild NYC curriculum.
Awesome. So we'll send you all those resources in the follow-up email, probably sometime tomorrow. So going on to some of the questions that we got throughout the workshop, someone was wondering, are bumblebees good pollinators? Do they sting?
So yes and yes. So bumblebees are very efficient pollinators. In fact, they may be more efficient than honeybees. So another reason that we should be conserving, creating as much pollinator habitat as possible, because we may not even need all the services that honeybees provide in agricultural settings. So so they're very efficient pollinators. And then the second part is, I mean, they can, yes, they can sting, but it's very rare for them to do that. And they only do it when they're threatened. And yeah, I'm trying to, first, I should also disclaim that I am not an entomologist. So I am an environmental educator like you. So I'm kind of like filing through all of the information that I have about stinging, and they are able to sting, but I believe, and I'll double check, I'll fact check that and correct myself if that's not true. But it's very rare, and they only do it when they're threatened.
Okay. This is another similar question. Do carpenter bees sting? Is that kind of a similar situation?
Similar situation with the bumblebees, in that genus, yeah, is that they to sting, but it's rare, and only when they're threatened.
Okay. And someone also was asking how to help students become more comfortable around, or even other educators become more comfortable around bees. But I think you addressed that a little bit in terms of just kind of slowly easing people into it and modeling the behavior for them, and how nothing terrible happens if you're just calm around them.
And let students take steps that they feel comfortable with. If it's really anxiety producing, make sure they're in a space where they feel comfortable, and show and model how you can safely observe bees, and just really reinforce that they're not coming after you.
Right. And I'm wondering if it's someone who's allergic to bees, if that's just take an extra level of caution. Someone had a question about that as well.
Yeah, and I don't mean to minimize people that have serious bee allergies. I think you should definitely take precautions if you do have serious bee allergies, or one of your students do. But I will just kind of, yeah, just repeat that it's quite rare for bees to sting unless they're threatened or maybe stepped on. Wasps can be a little bit more aggressive when they're often attracted to the sweet foods that we eat. So sometimes like juices or soda. So they can kind of be problematic if they're in that situation with you.
Okay, good to know. Someone recently got a beehive and bought a bee colony that is thriving, and they're wondering how to provide necessities for them. So it sounds like this person maybe hasn't been to like a beekeeper training course yet. Do you have anything you would recommend for a beginner beekeeper?
You know, I like personally I really don't know much about beekeeping. So I'm sorry, but I don't have much. But I know there are a lot of beekeepers and groups in New York City that may be able to provide you with the resources you're looking for.
Yeah, one we've worked with in the past was the Honeybee Conservancy, and they're a nonprofit based in New York City. So they might be someone to reach out to that they do some classes, but I definitely would recommend taking a pretty in-depth course because it's like having an agricultural animal that requires a lot of oversight and maintenance so that you can keep it going and do it in a safe way. And as Sarah mentioned earlier, making sure that, it's not spreading disease around the city either, because that can be a problem with honeybee colonies.
Yeah, I think another important consideration too is with honeybees is that maybe like, sometimes honeybees have, they can travel pretty far. And so it might be important to plant flowers for them too, so that they're not competing with the native species as much, because that is one of the problems with the competition between honeybees and native bees.
All right. Someone says that there's a small area near Clearview Expressway where milkweed grows, but DOT keeps mowing it down. Is there a monarch protection group that can help advocate for this to not keep happening? Do you think the pollinator group is a place to do that?
Yes, it's a place for, I'm not saying we can make the DOT stop doing that, but there are a lot of professionals, parks professionals in the group, and it might just be a matter of educating the supervisor of that site, right? Because you can time your mowing to help pollinators, and that's something that that's easy to do. And there are like ordinances that cities can pass that encourage that as well. So yes, please join us at the Pollinator Working Group.
All right, and I think this might be one of the last questions, and we are nearing the end of the workshop. So someone's asking, can you certify a pollinator, like an NWF pollinator habitat space on Long Island, or is that just a New York City thing?
Yeah, it's all over. Yeah, so this is a program that connects habitats all over the US. So absolutely, I'm going to drop some of these resources into the chat too, so that you have them now, and we'll also definitely share them with you in a follow-up email.
Awesome. There was one other thing I was thinking of when you said to create the pollinator habitats, leaving out the puddle trays or little drinking stations for pollinators. A lot of our school gardens have had issues with mosquitoes. And what we learned is that in the mosquito life cycle, as long as you dump out the water every 3 days or so, that will get rid of the mosquito eggs so that they won't mature. And so that's also like a fun garden task for kids, is to go out and like dump the puddle dishes and refill them.
Yeah, that's a great point, because mosquitoes can be really a real nuisance in some of our gardens in New York City. But you're absolutely right. Just make sure you clean the water every 2 to 3 days, and they won't be able to breed in that.
Someone's asking, do city schools need permits to place garden boxes as habitats?
If it's on the school grounds, no, there should be no reason you need a permit for that. So yeah, if you have the space for it, then yeah, then kind of create a team at your school to help make this happen. Because yeah, you can absolutely do that.
I see at school gardens the signs that they're a pollinator habitat, and it's a source of pride for people at the school and the students. And it does, you can see it from the road, so a lot of people walking by can learn about it as well, which is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. It helps educate other people too, and it helps them understand that the plants that you're putting in in your garden have an ecological purpose. So I think it goes a long way for that. And one complaint that sometimes you hear when you use native plants or naturalistic type planting is that the garden looks messy. But I think when you have something like that in the garden, sort of announcing that it has this value, it helps. It helps for people that may not be familiar with this type of landscape or gardening.
Great. And so I see that Sarah put some links in there. We will be sending you the recording, and we will be sending you all of these follow-up links. I'm going to add one, if people are interested, we have a workshop on inviting bats to your garden, which I actually don't know much about bats. I think they can also be pollinators, but it's mostly a mosquito control thing as well. So we have that workshop tomorrow. And then I'm going to put in the chat as well the rest of our workshops that we have coming up. On Tuesday, May 25th, we'll be exploring New York City's water story with the DEP. So that's another virtual workshop. And then the week of June 1st, we're going to be doing our beginner gardener intensive, which is great for any beginner gardeners, people who are trying to start a school garden, or even gardens at your homes. It's like 4 virtual workshops throughout the week to get your garden project started. So we have that to look forward to as well. I believe that's everything we needed to tell you today. Sarah, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, just thank you. Thank you for attending, and please feel free to reach out to me anytime. If you're planning a pollinator garden or you need tips or any kind of technical information. Yeah, and just encourage you to, yeah, keep your eyes peeled and start to observe the pollinators that do share our home here in New York City. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll be in touch with the follow-up resources. Have a good rest of your afternoon. Bye.